I want to talk today about my new book, which is going to come out on the 1st, that is, in a couple days. The title of the book is called The Invisible Handcuffs: How Market Tyranny Stifles the Economy by Stunting Workers. The book has two parallel threads. The first one is the way that economics has gone out of its way to avoid any consideration or any discussion of work, workers, or working conditions, except to the extent that workers engage in a transaction by trading their leisure for a job. The wage is, of course, the central price of that transaction. But as far as what they do on the job, it's non-existent for the most part in terms of economic theory. At times, economists have strayed into the area, and they have always been severely reprimanded. The second theme that the book talks about, and I'll get back to this first theme later, is the way that economics, by avoiding any considerations of work, workers, or working conditions, has made a big mistake because it contributes to a workplace in which workers are really neglected, except to the extent that they do exactly what they're supposed to do. In contrast, the book suggests that by allowing workers to use their creativity, by minimizing hierarchy and discipline, and by instead allowing workers to display initiative, business would be more effective. Except in that case, it would no longer be a capitalist business, because the kind of work relationships I'm discussing are incompatible with the market economy. Let me go back to the first and give you an example of how economists have managed to avoid any discussion of work, workers, or working conditions. One of the most famous little snippets of economics comes from Adam Smith in his discussion of the invisible hand. Well, it turns out that his second most famous discussion is about the fin factory. And these two are related in the following sense, that the pin factory purports to be about discussions of a workplace, but in fact, what Smith has done has been to mischaracterize exactly what the workplace was and what it was about. The invisible hand, instead, describes an economy in which everything is driven by transactions. So let me go back to this pin factory thing and tell you how it works. Smith famously compared what an individual worker could produce in making pins, and compares that to what the average worker would do in a pin factory. And of course, the pin factory, which with its division of labor, produces many thousands times more pins than an individual worker. Part of the reason, a part that Smith does not emphasize, was that in describing this individual worker, the worker was expected to dig up the ore, melt it down, reform it into a wire, and at that point begin working as a pin maker, that is, cutting the wire, stamping a head on it, and sharpening the end. Whereas in the pin factory, work commences with the wire already made. So his comparison of the two would be something like me saying that the typical checkout worker in a supermarket happens to be many hundreds times more effective than a typical farmer, because the farmer can only feed maybe 15, 20, 25 people. Well, more than that, but the worker at the checkout stand can, in a year, feed thousands and thousands of people, many, many times more than the farmer could make. The comparisons then are ridiculous. Smith also neglects to tell you about a real modern pin factory, which was almost a century old by the time he was writing. And it was a pin factory that had equipment that was run by water when the water was available, and when the water wasn't available, used a steam engine in order to lift water up to make the water mill work. It was highly automated. This modern pin factory, which predated Smith's pin factory, was very famous, and Arthur Young, for example, whose works were cited in Parliament many, many more times than that of Adam Smith. Arthur Young wrote about it extensively and recommended that people visit this pin factory because it had so much to teach them about modern industry. Smith also neglected to mention that when he went back to his home, where he was born, to write The Wealth of Nations, he lived in the same neighborhood as the largest industrial plant in the world, the famous Cannon Works, which made large cannons for the British Navy. The Cannon Works also produced raw material for nails, and in the same paragraphs in which Smith talks about the pin factory and the division of labor, he mentions in passing the nailers, the young boys who made the nails. What he neglects to mention is that the nail masters were paid by the Cannon Works to move there, and the management of the Cannon Works arranged to have orphans given to the nail masters to make the nails. All we hear of about the nail workers in Smith is that these nail workers were very dexterous. Nothing about their conditions as mistreated orphans. I use the word mistreated because there were frequent objections and reprimands from the orphanages about the mistreatment of these young boys, not to mention their exploitation. Another way you see the difference between economics as ideology and economics describing the way the world works comes in the late 1870s, after the Paris Revolution, the Paris Commune, where the workers rose up and more or less ran the biggest city in France until the French military was rearmed by the Germans, who then attacked the city and defeated the Commune. And then a few years later, there was a great railroad strike in 1877, in which organized workers showed a great deal of power in the United States. In the face of these actions, you had independently Leon Walras in Switzerland, Karl Menger in Austria, and William Stanley Jevons in England, all proposing a new kind of economic analysis based on utility rather than production. And the idea of this was that everybody was paid exactly what they deserved, and that nobody should object to the existing system known as capitalism. At the same time, major economists in the United States, some of the leading advocates of this highly ideological form of economics, proposed a different kind of economics that existed side by side with this conventional market-based economics. At the time, the railroads, which were the largest industry in the United States, were going bankrupt time and time again. And the reason was, of course, competition, the same competition that their other economic theory praised, was causing prices to go below what the railroads could earn. They would pay off their heavy fixed costs. This kind of competition extended beyond railroads to newly heavily industrialized manufacturing, and bankruptcies were becoming common all over. To avoid bankruptcy, first J.P. Morgan and then other financiers worked to create trust cartels and monopolies to avoid competition. And the same economists who would talk about the wonders of competition and how everybody would be paid exactly what they deserved would turn around and write articles and would tell Congress that competition was destructive and that something had to be done to minimize competition. This was a form of economics that went directly against what the textbook economics said. Ironically, the economists who were proposing this alternative type of economics founded the American Economic Association, the largest economics association in the world, to resist the kind of conventional economics that was being taught in the universities. These same economists were almost all educated in Germany and tended to be both respectful to and in some ways parallel to Karl Marx. Okay. Now I'm running out of time. I just want to take a few minutes and talk about Marx and this other kind of economics in which workers' creativity becomes preeminent. Here what you saw was something entirely different. In the Grundrisse, Marx had a remarkable passage in which he was saying capitalism has done a wonderful job in minimizing the amount of labor required to produce a good. And you see this all over, especially in intellectual property. He said, then what good is capitalism? Once it's achieved this, it would be like this is my own analogy, it would be like a restaurant fretting about how much money they spend for a low-cost input such as salt. That they would do far better, industry would, in terms of productivity, if instead of driving the worker to save a few pennies, to unleash the worker's creativity and have the worker be able to produce more efficiently. Very quickly, there was one example from a Harvard business professor, because I'm running out of time, who described a paper mill which had opened up its computer system to everybody, and the workers were taking advantage, and they were making fantastic improvements in productivity, and management, threatened by workers showing their own creativity and abilities, which minimized the need for management, shut down the computer system, at least